Hello everyone, let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about the skeletal system and specifically bone and cartilage. When we talked about the four types of tissue in the body, we said that those included epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle, and nerve. And under the category of connective tissue, we talked about three specific types: connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. So today we're going to be talking about supporting connective tissue, which includes both bone and cartilage. The skeletal system is made up of bone, cartilage, ligaments, tendons, and joints. Bone and cartilage are supporting connective tissue. The tendons and ligaments are actually made out of dense, regular connective tissue proper. We'll be talking about tendons and ligaments when we talk about the joints. When we compare bone and cartilage as types of supporting connective tissue, it's the matrix material in this tissue that is different. In bone, it's a solid matrix material, and in cartilage, it's softer. It's a semi-solid material. So let's begin by talking about bone. Bone is actually the primary organ in the skeletal system, and bone is a very dynamic tissue. In other words, it's not a tissue that is created in the body and then just sits there. It actually changes constantly. Not only does bone change in the fetus and in childhood, but once a person reaches adulthood, there is continuous remodeling going on in the bones. Now, there are two general types of bone. There's what we call compact bone, and there is spongy bone. If you were to look at the mass of all of the bones in the body, about 80% of it would be compact, 20% spongy. Now, the other word we use to describe compact bone is cortical bone. And that word cortical means outside. Cortical bone is found on the exterior regions of bones, and spongy bone tends to be found in the interior regions, if it's present at all. Compact or cortical bone is very smooth and very solid. In comparison, spongy bone also goes by the name cancellous bone and trabecular bone. Spongy bone, again, tends to sit inside of a layer of compact bone. And spongy bone, by its nature, is quite porous. There's a lot of space in and around the regions of spongy bone that are referred to as trabeculae. On this slide, we're looking at a light microscope image of compact bone. Remember, all tissue, bone included, contains cells and extracellular matrix. When we look in at this cortical bone, the cells appear as these dark, even black circles and ovals, and the material around that is extracellular matrix. Now, among these cells, there are what we refer to as osteocytes, and that word translates as bone cell. There are also osteoblasts and osteoclasts. The blast type of cell is the cell that makes new bone, and the clast type of cell is the cell that removes old bone. So there's lots of different types of cells in here. Osteocytes, the sort of general bone cell, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. Now, just like all extracellular matrix, the matrix of bone is made out of protein fibers, ground substance, and water. On this slide, we can see a drawing of both cortical bone and spongy bone. And down below, we can see a section through some actual bone. So if you look at the image at the top, what you're looking at in blue is a layer of articular cartilage. This tells us that this piece of bone was pulled from the region of a joint. Within the cartilage, you can see a layer of bone that is solid. This is compact bone. And then within the compact bone, you can see a layer of bone that is porous. This is spongy bone. Where you see these sort of twists and turns of bone material, these are what we call trabeculae. Now, when you look into actual bone, when you're not looking under the microscope, cortical bone appears at the edges of the bone, very solid again. And then interior to that, you see the spongy bone. Over here, you can see cortical bone and spongy bone. We're actually looking at a cut section through the hip. This is the hip joint. This is the head of the femur right here, and what's called the acetabulum in the pelvis, where the femur connects. Now, when we compare bone to cartilage, there are some significant differences. First of all, cartilage is different from bone because cartilage is avascular. As we saw in the previous image, there is a defined vascular supply that feeds bone, but cartilage is avascular. Just like we saw with bone, there are two types of cartilage. There's what's called hyaline cartilage and what's called fibrocartilage. Now, hyaline cartilage gets its name because of its appearance. That word hyaline translates as glassy or translucent. And hyaline cartilage has a definite glassy look to it. It's hyaline cartilage that forms the very first skeleton inside of a fetus. Adults, you will still find hyaline cartilage because it's hyaline cartilage that makes up the articular surface in joints, in the places where bones connect to each other to create joints. Hyaline cartilage is also what connects the ribs to the sternum. Fibrocartilage is very different. Fibrocartilage has a very different look to it. Instead of appearing glassy, it has a much more textured look to it. Fibrocartilage is a weight-bearing type of tissue. You can find it in intervertebral discs, the discs that sort of cushion the vertebrae around the spinal cord. It forms the connections of the pelvis that is called the pubic symphysis, and it's part of the knee joint. It forms what are called the menisci inside the knee. On this slide, we're looking at some light microscope images of hyaline cartilage. If you look at the image on the lower left, they're showing us the bones that contribute to the knee joint. The tibia is here on the bottom, and the femur is up at the top. And this sort of bluish gray material that sits on the surface of both of those bones is articular cartilage. You can also see cartilage on the surface of the patella or the kneecap. This articular cartilage is a critical component of the joint. It's going to help these bones glide smoothly past one another, and it's also going to provide some cushioning to the joint. When we look at the light microscope images on the right side of the slide, you can see the cells inside these little circular or oval cavities in the cartilage. These are actual compartments and they're called lacunae. The singular form of that word is lacuna and the plural is lacunae. The cells that we find in cartilage are called chondrocytes. If you look at the material that surrounds the lacunae in these two images, it has a very unique, very smooth appearance. This is what they refer to as a glassy appearance. You don't see any fibers stretching through this extracellular matrix material. It looks very smooth. The upper image also gives you a feeling of transparency, although some of that is due to the specific stain that was used to prepare this microscope slide. When you look at the bottom image, this was stained a little bit differently. Everything looks a little bit darker. But I think you'll still agree that the matrix around the lacunae has a very smooth appearance. And again, this is what is referred to as a glassy look. Compare that to the two images on this slide, which are fibrocartilage. Now, these images were taken at a lower magnification, so the cells look smaller here. But what's more important is the appearance of the extracellular matrix. It has a much different look. It looks more fibrous. It looks like there are fibers of material running through the space around the cells. You'll notice that the tissue takes up stain differently. It doesn't have a nice, smooth, even appearance. Up on the top, that's not nearly as noticeable, but you can definitely see this fibrous material running through the matrix in the bottom image. Now, we find fibrocartilage in a restricted number of sites in the body. Again, one of those sites is in the pubic symphysis. The symphysis is a connection between the pelvic bones. It's allowing for a little bit of movement between those bones, but not much. The pubic symphysis softens up in women who are in the process of labor and delivery. It softens and stretches and relaxes under the influence of hormones, and that allows for some flexibility in the pelvis as the baby is delivered. When we think about bone and the functions that it performs in the human body, there are 6 separate jobs that it does. Most obviously, bone is providing structural support to the body. It is literally the framework of the human body. It also provides levers in the body for movement because, of course, the bones provide attachment sites for skeletal muscles, and the skeletal muscles then contract and relax and move the bones. The bones of the skeletal system provide protection particularly of the internal organ systems. Bones are also a site of blood production, what we refer to as hematopoiesis. This is a terrible word to spell, but it refers to the formation of blood or the production of blood. In the innermost cavity of certain bones, there is bone marrow, and particularly red bone marrow. And it's that red bone marrow that is the site of hematopoiesis. There are stem cells in red bone marrow that will divide and produce not only the red blood cells, but also the various white blood cells. Bones are a place where various minerals are stored in the body. We often think about calcium in connection with bones. Phosphate is another important compound that is stored in bones. Calcium is involved in all kinds of things in the body. Muscle contraction is one, blood clotting, and even cell-to-cell communication, or what we call cell signaling. Phosphate is involved in the production of ATP, the energy-rich molecule used by the human body and other organisms. Phosphate is part of nucleic acid synthesis and also phospholipid synthesis, a very important molecule. Both calcium and phosphate are stored in bones. And finally, lipid is stored in marrow in certain types of bone. Now, this is a different kind of marrow. This is what we refer to as yellow bone marrow. This is the kind of bone marrow that is not actively producing blood, not going through hematopoiesis, but instead is a storage site for fat and other types of lipids. Now, when we look at the human skeleton, there are all different types of bones in here with lots of different shapes and sizes. And we can classify those bones based upon their shape. The first type of bone is referred to simply as long bone, and it's the long bones that are the most common bones in the human skeleton. Long bones are greater in their length than they are in their width. So think about the tibia or the femur, the radius, the ulna. Those are all long bones. The length of the bone is much longer than the width is. The elongated shaft portion of a long bone gets a name. It's called the diaphysis. In fact, all of the regions of long bones get a name. We'll talk about those next. So the bones of the upper and lower arms, the upper and lower legs, the bones in the palms of your hands, the bones in your fingers, in your feet, in your toes, all of those are long bones. Next on the list are the short bones. A short bone is a bone that has a length that is approximately the same as its width. So if you think about the various bones that are in the wrist, bones that make up the ankle, those are short bones. There are bones called sesamoid bones that lie along certain tendons in the body. The patella or the kneecap is another short bone. The length is approximately equal to the width of the bone. The third type of bone is flat bone, and like the name suggests, flat bones are flat and they're also typically thin. Flat bones provide a nice surface area for skeletal muscle attachment, and you'll find flat bones in the cranium of the skull, the scapula, which is the shoulder blades, the sternum, and the ribs. And finally, the fourth type of bone is simply referred to as irregular bone, because there are some bones that just don't fit neatly into the other three categories. These are bones that just have unique, unusual shapes. So the vertebrae, certain of the skull bones fall into the irregular category. The hip bone of the pelvis, these are irregular bones.